Flight crew gave expired milk to a black CEO's baby. Unaware, he funded the company's entire expansion. You must join our channel and hit subscribe, because only those who believe no black baby should be poisoned will do it before this story begins. The moment the plane's door closed behind him, David Langston's heart tightened with a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. The cabin was pristine, soft lighting, polished seats, and the faint hum of the engines barely audible beneath the low murmur of passengers settling in. Yet, despite the serene environment, David's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. His infant son, Julian, nestled gently in his wife Marcus's arms, cooed softly, unaware of the tension swirling around them. David didn't look away from his son for long. Julian's delicate fingers curled and uncurled rhythmically, a small smile flickering on his cherubic face as if sensing the promise of safety in his father's presence. But David's eyes quickly returned to the cabin aisle, where the flight attendants moved briskly, their faces a mix of professionalism and strain. He had been on hundreds of flights before, but something about today felt different, an undercurrent of fragility beneath the surface. His thoughts snapped back to the upcoming board meeting of Cloudreach Airlines. Titan Aero's recent contract to expand Cloudreach's fleet was more than a business deal. It was the key to David's vision of revolutionizing the skies. Securing controlling interest meant more than profits. It meant influence, power, and the chance to reshape an entire industry. Yet that vision felt precarious, vulnerable to forces he hadn't fully accounted for. David's gaze swept over the cabin again, catching the young flight attendant, Simon Graves, fumbling slightly as he approached Marcus and Julian. Simon's youthful eagerness was obvious. Too obvious. The kind of nervous energy that makes a man risk mistakes, especially when dealing with a baby's fragile needs. David's chest tightened with a silent warning he couldn't voice aloud. He wanted to trust the crew, but years of hard-earned experience told him otherwise. "Mr. Langston, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask," Simon said, his voice polite but slightly shaky as he offered a small smile. His eyes flickered nervously between Julian and Marcus, betraying his inexperience. David nodded curtly but didn't reply. His focus remained split on his son, on the flight crew, on the looming meeting. He watched as Simon moved away to the galley, retrieving what appeared to be a bottle of milk. The container was small, unassuming, but David's heart skipped a beat. He felt an inexplicable chill crawl down his spine as the attendant returned to feed Julian. The baby's mouth opened eagerly at first, sucking the milk with quiet contentment. But then, barely minutes later, Julian's expression shifted. His tiny brow furrowed, his lips trembled, and the soft coos turned to urgent cries. "Julian," Marcus whispered, panic seeping into her voice as she instinctively held him closer. David rose quickly, tension crackling in his every movement. "Something's wrong," David said, voice low but firm. He knelt beside his wife, eyes scanning Julian's pale face, the sudden loss of color alarming him. The cries escalated into uncontrollable wails as Julian vomited violently, his body trembling against Marcus's arms. The cabin atmosphere shifted instantly. Passengers turned to stare. The crew scrambled. Simon's face drained of color, guilt and fear flashing in his eyes as he realized the gravity of the situation. David clenched his jaw, fighting the surge of anger and helplessness rising within him. His son's well-being was suddenly in jeopardy, and so was everything he had worked for. "Call for medical assistance." "Now," David commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with authority born from desperation. His mind raced. There was no airport nearby, no immediate aid. Time was slipping through his fingers, and with it, the fragile thread holding his world together. As the plane continued slicing through the cold morning sky, David's thoughts darkened. This was supposed to be a routine flight, a simple business trip. But the simple act of feeding his son had triggered a crisis with stakes far beyond the cabin walls. His vision for Titan Aero's future, the contract with Cloudreach, even his family's safety. Everything now hung in a precarious balance. David's eyes narrowed with determination as he stared ahead, refusing to let panic take hold. Whatever had caused Julian's sudden illness, he vowed to uncover it. The path forward was uncertain and dangerous, but retreat was not an option. This flight was supposed to be routine, but it would change everything. The moment the baby started crying, the cabin's calm shattered. Simon Graves, the young flight attendant assigned to David Langston's family, froze for a brief second, confusion spreading across his face. Julian's small fists flailed in the air, and the sharp wails echoed sharply through the sleek, polished cabin. Simon quickly moved closer, trying to soothe the infant, but it was clear something was wrong. The baby's cries escalated, growing more frantic and desperate. Then, without warning, Julian vomited violently, the warm liquid splattering across his tiny clothes and onto the pristine seat beside him. David's heart dropped. He had been engrossed in reviewing notes on his tablet moments before, but now his attention snapped to his son's distress. Panic bubbled beneath his usually controlled exterior. "Julian, what's wrong, buddy?" David murmured, voice tight with concern as he gently lifted the baby from the seat, cradling him close. Marcus, seated beside David, was instantly alert. Her eyes widened with alarm, and she carefully took Julian from David's arms. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked his face, now pale and sweaty. "He's burning up," she whispered, voice barely steady. "Simon, what did you give him?" Simon swallowed hard, guilt washing over his face. "It was milk. I grabbed it from the galley fridge. I thought it was fresh. I didn't check the date," he admitted, eyes downcast, voice shaky. David's mind raced. He knew that a baby's health was fragile and the symptoms didn't bode well. "We need medical help. Now," he said firmly, rising from his seat with urgency in his posture. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted palpably. Other passengers glanced nervously toward the Langston family, whispers and concerned murmurs spreading. The flight attendants exchanged worried looks as Simon hurried to inform the lead pilot. The intercom crackled to life moments later with an announcement. The crew was seeking the nearest airport to make an emergency landing. Julian's cries began to fade into weak whimpers. His small body felt limp against Marcus's chest, his skin clammy and cool. David's face tightened with fear and frustration. "How could this happen?" he muttered under his breath, his gaze flicking between Simon and the flight crew scrambling to act. Simon's hands trembled slightly as he tried to keep calm, moving through the cabin with a new sense of urgency. "I was just trying to do my job," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, the weight of his mistake settling heavily on his shoulders. Meanwhile, David dialed his personal phone, fingers clenched tightly as he prepared to call for medical advice and support once they landed. His mind was a storm of fears, for Julian's health, for the damage this incident could do to his reputation, and for the fragile business deal resting on this very flight. The minutes stretched agonizingly as the plane cruised toward the designated diversion airport. Simon kept glancing toward Julian's seat, guilt gnawing at him with every passing second. The thought that something so small, a container of milk, could upend so much was almost unbearable. David's eyes never left his son. "Hold on, Julian," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. "We're going to get you help. I promise." The cabin lights seemed dimmer now. The once sleek and quiet environment turned tense and uneasy. Passengers exchanged worried glances. Some pulled out their phones, discreetly filming or messaging updates. The scandal that no one saw coming was unfolding quietly, yet inevitably. Simon stood near the galley, alone for a moment, running the events over in his head. Had he missed something? Could he have prevented this? The answer was a painful no. As the plane began its slow descent, David gripped Marcus's hand, steadying himself despite the storm of emotions inside. The weight of what was happening pressed on him, more than just a father's fear. It was the beginning of a crisis that would ripple far beyond this flight. Simon's mistake was about to trigger a chain of consequences no one expected. The moment Julian went silent in Marcus's arms, the entire cabin seemed to freeze. His tiny body, once full of life and the soft sounds of infant curiosity, now lay limp and pale, drained of color and strength. Marcus's hands trembled as she cradled him tightly, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and mounting fear. She had insisted on joining this flight, refusing to leave her son behind despite David's protests about the tight schedule. Now, every instinct screamed at her that something was terribly wrong. David's gaze snapped sharply from Julian to Marcus, his heart pounding with a fierce urgency that swallowed all other thoughts. "Marcus, what's happening? Talk to me," he demanded, voice low but edged with panic. He reached out, carefully taking Julian into his own arms, feeling the baby's weak pulse against his skin. The sounds of the cabin, the murmur of passengers, the low hum of engines faded into the background. All that existed was Julian's fragile body and the silent scream David felt rising inside. Marcus swallowed hard, her voice cracking as she whispered, "He's burning up, and he won't stop crying." Then, suddenly, he just went still. Her normally calm demeanor was shattered, replaced by a raw desperation that made David's chest tighten. She looked at him, eyes pleading, silently asking for reassurance neither of them had. David's mind raced. Every scenario flashed through his thoughts. Was it something he fed Julian? The bottle of milk? His mind snapped back to the flight attendant, Simon, fumbling nervously just moments ago. Had that milk been safe? The gnawing suspicion twisted his gut. He couldn't let this be a simple accident. Not with so much on the line. Not with his son's life hanging in the balance. "Call for the captain. We need to get this baby help immediately," David ordered, his voice sharp, commanding attention. Cabin crew hurried past, their faces pale with worry. The flight attendants moved quickly now, urgency pulsing through the once orderly cabin. David's eyes never left Julian, whose soft breaths had become shallow, almost imperceptible. As the plane descended, every second felt stretched, heavy with dread. David's fingers tightened instinctively around Julian's small hand, a silent vow that he would not let anything happen to him. He looked toward Marcus, who was biting her lip, trying to hold back tears but failing. "We'll get through this," he said, though even he struggled to believe his own words. Once on the ground, the rush to the hospital was swift. David's world narrowed to the sterile white walls and the sharp scent of antiseptic as doctors swarmed around Julian. The pediatrician's face was grave, eyes flickering between monitors and David's anxious expression. "Severe food poisoning," the doctor finally announced, voice steady but heavy. "It appears the milk the baby consumed was expired and contaminated. We're doing everything we can, but his condition is serious." David's fury surged beneath the surface, barely contained. This wasn't a simple mistake or oversight. Someone had failed in their duty, either through gross negligence or something far more sinister. His business instincts told him that this was no accident. This was a message. This was more than a mistake. It was a warning. The moment David stepped out of the hospital room, the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a storm about to break. Julian lay inside, hooked up to machines, fragile and vulnerable, while outside David's mind raced with questions. The expired milk was no mere accident. This was a calculated blow aimed at more than just his son. Determined to get to the root of the poisoning, David dove into the maze of suppliers and contracts, his gaze sharp as a hawk's. It didn't take long before he traced the milk back to Pure Dairy Solutions, a modest local company that Cloudreach had recently signed on to cut costs. David's brows knitted as he sifted through records and reports. Pure Dairy wasn't just a newcomer. It was a company with a checkered past, known for rushing deliveries and skirting safety protocols. Deliveries had arrived late, and some batches had been flagged for questionable freshness, but none of this had ever been thoroughly investigated by Cloudreach's complacent management. David's frustration grew with each new piece of evidence, feeling the suffocating grip of negligence wrapped around the airline's operations. The realization that his own son's life had been endangered by this careless cost-cutting was almost unbearable. Yet what unsettled David most was an anonymous tip that landed like a thunderclap on his desk late one evening. The message was brief, cold, and sharp. There was a faction within Cloudreach's leadership working actively to sabotage the partnership with Titan Aero, a faction that saw David's expansion plans as a threat to their own power. His fingers trembled slightly as he read the words again. This wasn't just a case of corporate sloppiness or an unfortunate accident. This was something darker, internal betrayal wrapped in shadows, twisting beneath the surface of the company he thought he was helping to save. He felt the edges of paranoia creeping in, but pushed it aside. David knew from years of experience that suspicion was a necessary weapon in the corporate battlefield. He summoned Helen Banks, his trusted CFO, into his office late that night. The room was dimly lit, the hum of the city muffled outside the windows. Helen was a stoic figure, her sharp eyes often reading situations before anyone else could. She entered quietly, closing the door behind her. "We need to be careful with this, David," Helen began, her voice low but firm. She perched on the edge of his desk, her fingers steepled thoughtfully. "If the wrong people catch wind that you're probing too deep, this could blow up in our faces. We risk losing not just the contract, but everything you've built here." David's jaw tightened. He looked up at Helen, the weight of his decision clear in his eyes. "I know the risks, Helen, but if this was sabotage, I will find out who was behind it." His voice was calm but resolute, a man who refused to be intimidated by invisible enemies. David's confrontation with Simon Graves was immediate and unyielding. He found the young flight attendant waiting nervously near the galley, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights of the airplane's service area. The air was thick with tension, every sound magnified, the hum of the ventilation system, the distant murmur of passengers, the faint clinking of utensils in the background. David's voice cut through the silence, steady but firm. "Simon, tell me exactly what happened with that milk," David demanded, his eyes searching the young man's for any sign of deceit. Simon swallowed hard, running a trembling hand through his sweat-damp hair. I didn't know it was expired, Mr. Langston. I swear, the galley supervisor, Victor Crane, told me it was fresh. I just grabbed the bottle from the fridge like I was told." David's jaw tightened. The name Victor Crane was familiar, a long-tenured employee known for his rigid loyalty to Cloudreach, but also for his antagonism toward Titan Aero's growing influence. David had heard whispers of Crane's resentment before, but now it seemed this resentment had taken a dangerous form. "Victor Crane," David muttered under his breath, a dark storm brewing in his eyes. "He's the weak link." But mere suspicion was not enough. He needed proof, concrete, undeniable proof. The conversation lingered, Simon's voice faltering under the weight of his own guilt and fear. David pressed for details on who else had access to the galley and supply deliveries, cataloging every name and every routine. The young attendant's hesitation betrayed his unease, and David could tell the situation was taking its toll on him. Leaving Simon behind, David's mind raced as he walked through the narrow aisles toward the cockpit. Every step was heavy with urgency and responsibility. Julian's fragile condition tugged at his heart, a constant gnawing reminder of what was truly at stake. The baby's pale cheeks and weak cries haunted David's thoughts even as he prepared his next move. Back in the executive lounge once the plane had landed, David convened a confidential meeting with Helen Banks, his trusted CFO and closest advisor. The room was sterile, yet the air was charged with unspoken tension. Helen's sharp eyes met his, filled with a mixture of concern and cautious optimism. "We need to catch Crane in the act," David said plainly. "Discreet surveillance, cameras in the supply area, monitoring all deliveries. If he's sabotaging us, we'll get the evidence we need." Helen nodded, her fingers tapping rapidly on the polished table. "I'll arrange the logistics, but this has to stay under wraps. If the news leaks about Julian—" David cut her off with a shake of his head. "No leaks. Not a word outside this room." His voice hardened. "If this gets out, it's not just the deal at risk. It's everything." Over the following days, David's world became a relentless balancing act. Between hospital visits where doctors monitored Julian's fluctuating condition, he found himself glued to his phone, fielding calls from corporate lawyers, CloudReach executives, and the security team setting up surveillance measures. Each new task pulled him further from the bedside, yet his resolve only grew stronger. At the hospital, the sterile white walls and the soft beep of monitors became a constant backdrop to his growing anxiety. Julian's tiny form rested in an incubator, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. David's hand hovered above the glass, aching to reach in, to protect him from everything. "I'm sorry, Julian," David whispered one evening, voice breaking. "I won't let them get away with this." His team's work progressed steadily. Discrete cameras were installed in the supply storage and delivery zones aboard multiple flights. The equipment was state-of-the-art but hidden cleverly to avoid detection. David knew Victor Crane's confidence might lead him to underestimate such measures, a mistake Crane would soon regret. Still, uncertainty gnawed at David. Every call, every update, carried the weight of potential disaster. Meanwhile, rumors of the scandal began to stir in social media circles, whispers and speculative posts hinting at a poisoned baby on a CloudReach flight. The public was on edge, and David's carefully guarded reputation teetered on a knife's edge. He couldn't shake the image of Simon's shaken face, nor the cold certainty that Victor Crane's sabotage was only the beginning. David was racing against time on two fronts: his son's life and his company's future. The cameras revealed more than David had anticipated. Over the course of several flights, the surveillance footage captured Victor Crane in unmistakable acts of subversion. Under the cloak of night, Victor was seen meeting with a courier whose face remained obscured by a hooded jacket, exchanging brief words in hushed tones. What alarmed David most was the delivery itself: cartons of milk that were swiftly unloaded and then swapped with older stock, bottles clearly marked with expiration dates long past. The images left no doubt. Victor's actions were deliberate sabotage, not the result of negligence or oversight. The cold, fluorescent lights of the CloudReach supply room cast harsh shadows on Victor's furtive movements, each sequence on the monitors like a scene from a suspense film. David's jaw tightened as he leaned closer to the screen, feeling the weight of betrayal deepen with every frame. David's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together in a disturbing pattern. This wasn't just about one bad batch of milk. It was a calculated attack against him and Titan Arrow's growing influence. The realization hit him hard. Victor was waging a quiet war, using his position to poison more than just supplies. Every delivery he tampered with threatened not only Julian's health but the very foundation of the partnership David had fought so hard to secure. Without hesitation, David arranged a private meeting with Victor, framing it as a routine discussion on operational matters. The setting was deliberately neutral. A small, glass-walled conference room tucked away in CloudReach's headquarters, far from prying eyes and ears. The sterile room, bathed in the muted glow of overhead LEDs, was a stark contrast to the storm brewing between the two men. David sat upright, hands clasped on the polished table, eyes fixed on the door as Victor entered. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Victor's entrance was composed but strained. His usual smirk was replaced by a tight-lipped expression that betrayed underlying hostility. He nodded curtly, taking a seat opposite David, who immediately cut to the chase. "Victor, I've seen the footage," David said, voice steady but edged with steel. "You're aware that the milk deliveries have been compromised. Care to explain what's going on?" Victor's eyes flickered with a mixture of defiance and resentment. For a moment, he seemed on the verge of anger, but he carefully controlled his expression, masking his true feelings behind a veneer of professionalism. "I don't know what you think you've seen," Victor replied, his tone cool, but the slight tremor in his fingers betrayed him. "You're making a serious accusation." David leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "This isn't an accusation, Victor. It's a fact. The expired milk cartons you swapped were seen on camera, and the deliveries from the courier, you were caught accepting those too. This is sabotage, plain and simple." Victor's eyes darkened and his jaw clenched visibly. He stared down at the table for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire ready to snap. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with bitterness. "You think this is about milk or supplies? It's about everything you represent. Titan Arrow coming in, taking over, changing everything Cloudreach built." He paused, his gaze lifting to meet David's with a cold fire. "I've spent years watching you creep into this company, and I won't stand by and watch you destroy it." David's expression hardened. "If you're trying to send a message, Victor, you're playing a dangerous game. You're risking lives. My son's life." Victor's posture stiffened, but he refused to back down. "And you're risking this company's future. You want to push me out? Expose me? Go ahead." His voice lowered to a warning. "But know this, if you try to drag me into the light, it won't just be me you have to answer for. There are others. People in this building who'd rather see Cloudreach burn than fall into your hands." David sat back, absorbing the gravity of Victor's words. The bitterness behind Victor's actions was far more than personal spite. It hinted at a dangerous network ready to ignite chaos within Cloudreach's management. For the first time, David sensed the true scale of the threat he faced. This wasn't a simple internal dispute. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. As Victor rose to leave, his eyes held a final, cold warning. "You're stepping into something deeper than you realize." The door closed softly behind him, leaving David alone with the weight of the confrontation and the growing storm on the horizon. Victor's bitterness hid a dangerous game no one had yet seen. Sarah Cole slipped quietly through the polished glass doors of David Langston's office, clutching a thick folder of documents tightly under his arm. The late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the sleek conference table, but inside the room, tension hovered like a thick fog. David, seated behind his desk, looked up sharply as the door clicked shut. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion yet burning with determination, met Sarah's steady gaze. Without hesitation, Sarah approached and placed the folder carefully on the table. "Mr. Langston," she began, her voice low but urgent, "I've been reviewing some supply orders and payment records. There are irregularities, significant ones, and they all tie back to Victor Crane." David's jaw tightened. Victor, the galley supervisor, was already under suspicion for the milk incident that had endangered Julian. But Sarah's words hinted at something far larger, a web of deceit extending beyond a single man's grudge. He motioned for her to continue. Sarah pulled out several sheets of paper marked with internal codes, purchase orders, and transaction histories. "These payments," she said, tapping the folder, "show unauthorized transfers and inflated invoices linked to Victor. But it's not just him. I found traces pointing to other executives, senior staff who would benefit if Titan Arrow's expansion were to fail." David leaned forward, the weight of the revelation sinking in. His voice was tight but controlled. "How did you get access to this?" "I work in logistics. It's not part of my usual duties to dig this deep, but something felt off after the milk incident. I ran some queries and cross-checked vendor accounts. I had to be careful. This is dangerous information." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, but her eyes were resolute. David felt the walls closing in. The betrayal was no longer a single strike. It was a coordinated assault. The realization hammered at him like a storm. He had trusted some faces at Cloudreach, but now those faces hid knives. "Why come to me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "Because I believe you're the only one who can stop this, and because I want to make it right. Titan Aero's partnership could mean stability for this airline, but these people want to see it fail." David studied her carefully. She was young, her features sharp, eyes clear. But this wasn't just about company politics to her. It was personal. Maybe because she had seen firsthand the damage Victor and his allies had wrought. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Outside the office, the murmur of the city carried on obliviously, but inside, a new alliance was forming. David stood abruptly and paced the length of the room. "We need to map this out, everyone involved, their moves, their motives, and we have to act fast before they can strike again." Sarah nodded, relief and determination mixing on her face. "I've already begun compiling more data. We'll need surveillance, deeper access to internal communications, but we must be discreet." David's mind raced, balancing the urgency of corporate espionage with the fragile state of his son's health. The two battles, personal and professional, intertwined like strands of steel. He stopped and turned to Sarah, his expression grim but resolute. "You understand what this means. If we're caught digging too deep, the backlash could destroy everything. Our reputations, our contracts." "I know," she said softly, "but sitting idle means losing everything. I'm ready to fight." David exhaled slowly and nodded, a spark of renewed hope igniting within him. "Then we begin tonight. This is no longer about just a bottle of spoiled milk or a careless employee. It's a war, a shadow war inside the company." Sarah met his gaze steadily, and for a moment, the fear and exhaustion melted away, replaced by unyielding resolve. David was no longer fighting just for his son or his business. He was battling a shadow war within the company. The days dragged on with a relentless heaviness that pressed down on David Langston's chest. Julian's recovery was agonizingly slow, each hour filled with uncertainty and a deepening ache in David's heart. The sterile hospital room had become their world. Pale walls, the constant hum of machines, and the steady beep of monitors tracking Julian's fragile condition. David sat by his son's bedside for hours on end, watching the delicate rise and fall of Julian's chest, willing every breath to bring strength rather than weakness. His eyes were often rimmed red, his mind a whirl of fear and frustration. The doctor's words weighed heavily. Julian's immune system was severely compromised, and every day was a battle against infection and exhaustion. Outside the hospital, the world was closing in with a brutal intensity David could neither escape nor control. News outlets, once deferential, now chased the story like vultures. The leak had come from somewhere inside Cloud Reach, a tip to the media about the scandalous poisoning of a CEO's infant on a commercial flight. Social media exploded overnight, rumors spiraling wildly out of control. Messages flooded David's phone, some offering support, others dripping with suspicion, anger, or outright hostility. "How could this happen?" one message read. "Someone wanted them hurt." Another accused David of hiding the truth. Each notification felt like another stab into his already raw nerves. David's carefully cultivated public image began to fracture in real time. The pristine veneer of Titan Aero's business acumen was cracked by whispers and outrage. Board members sent cautious messages, investors grew restless, and his employees looked at him with a mix of sympathy and uncertainty. The pressure was suffocating, and David knew he needed to act swiftly, decisively, before the wildfire of scandal engulfed not only his company but his family. His legal advisors moved quickly, crafting a statement that balanced transparency with protection. The press conference was scheduled with military precision. David spent hours rehearsing his words in front of a mirror, stripping his tone of defensiveness and replacing it with measured resolve. When the day arrived, the conference room was thick with anticipation. Dozens of reporters clustered together, cameras flashing, microphones poised. Standing at the podium, David's gaze swept across the sea of faces, feeling the weight of every expectation. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but heavy. "First and foremost, my family's priority has been Julian's health and recovery. We are deeply grateful for the medical care he has received." He paused, eyes briefly closing as he swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "We are committed to full transparency and are cooperating with all investigations to ensure that this kind of incident never happens again." His words were carefully chosen, each syllable a shield against mounting speculation. Yet behind the calm exterior, David's mind raced. The leak had to be stopped, the source identified. He watched as reporters fired questions, some pointed, others veiled accusations. "Mr. Langston, can you guarantee the safety of future flights? How do you respond to allegations of internal sabotage?" The questions sliced through the room like knives. David's jaw tightened and he responded with the practiced diplomacy of a seasoned CEO. But inside, the cracks of doubt were widening. As the press conference ended and the crowd dispersed, David felt a cold unease settle deep within him. The poison was no longer confined to his infant son's body. It had seeped into the very fabric of his life, infecting relationships, trust, and reputation. The battle was far from over, and the enemies he faced were no longer just those visible in boardrooms or hospital corridors. Shadows lurked, waiting for their moment. Returning to the quiet of his office, David sank into his chair, hands trembling slightly as he stared out at the city skyline. His voice was barely a whisper, carrying the weight of a man caught in a relentless storm. The poison had spread beyond the baby. It was infecting David's entire world. If that moment made your heart ache and your blood boil, don't stay silent. Subscribe and become a member, because standing against negligence is how we protect the innocent. David's legal team had been working around the clock when the breakthrough came. A confidential internal report traced the anonymous tip about sabotage directly to Martin Keller, a high-ranking executive at Cloudreach Airlines. Keller was a man known not only for his ruthless business tactics but also for his deep-seated opposition to Titan Aero's growing influence within the airline. His reputation for playing hardball in corporate battles was legendary. And now, David faced the unsettling reality that one of Cloudreach's own power players was deeply involved in the conspiracy unraveling around him. Without hesitation, David arranged a covert meeting with Keller. The chosen venue was a quiet downtown cafe, tucked away from the prying eyes of media and corporate spies alike. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans and faint murmurs from other patrons, but the tension between the two men cut through the calm atmosphere like a sharpened blade. David arrived first, his gaze fixed on the door, his mind racing through every possible outcome. When Keller finally appeared, he carried the familiar cold confidence of a man used to commanding control. His sharp eyes scanned David, calculating and unreadable. They sat opposite each other in a secluded corner booth, the dim lighting casting shadows over their faces. David started the conversation without preamble. "Martin, we know you sent the tip. I need to understand your role. How far does your involvement go?" Keller's lips curled into a faint, almost mocking smile. "You're sharper than I thought, David. Yes, I orchestrated parts of the sabotage, but don't mistake me for the one who poisoned your son's milk. That wasn't my doing." David's jaw tightened, his mind flashing to the fragile baby whose life had been imperiled. "If not you, then who? And why target my son? This isn't just corporate sabotage, it's personal. Someone wanted to break me, destroy everything Titan Aero stands for." Leaning back, Keller's eyes darkened with a flicker of warning. "You're stepping into dangerous territory. There are players far more ruthless than me. People who don't care about business ethics or family. They want Titan Aero crushed. No compromises, no survivors." David's heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination. Who are they? What do they want? Keller's voice dropped to a gravelly whisper. "That's the question, isn't it? I can tell you this. They operate from the shadows, pulling strings you can't even see. If you push too hard, you might awaken forces that will make today's troubles look like child's play." The words hung heavy between them, a chilling foreshadowing of the battles yet to come. David studied Keller carefully. The man's usual arrogance was tempered now by a wary respect. It was clear Keller was trying to protect himself, and perhaps even David, from an invisible menace bigger than either of them. Outside the cafe, the city hummed with indifferent life, but inside, two powerful men sat locked in a silent war of wills, the stakes higher than either dared fully admit. David felt the weight of the web tightening around him, the strands pulling in every direction. He was no longer just fighting for his company or his son's recovery. He was tangled in a deadly game where every move could mean survival or destruction. As their meeting drew to a close, Keller fixed David with a final, steady look. David realized he was tangled in a web far larger and deadlier than he imagined. David sat alone in the dim light of his home office, the muted hum of the city outside doing nothing to soothe the storm raging in his mind. His fingers drummed nervously on the polished mahogany desk as he stared at the files spread before him, documents tracing suspicious financial transactions, fragmented phone records, and surveillance footage. Every thread he pulled only tangled him further in the web of deceit that threatened not just his company, but his family's safety. The poison that had reached his son Julian was only the beginning. He needed allies, but trust was a currency in short supply. Without hesitation, David picked up his phone and dialed Sarah Cole. Her quiet determination and knowledge of Cloudreach's internal workings made her indispensable. When she answered, her voice was steady but tinged with exhaustion. "David, I've been running numbers and cross-referencing supply orders. The pattern is worse than we thought. It's not just Victor Crane. Others are involved, executives hiding behind layers of shell companies." David's jaw tightened. "We need proof, and I need your eyes and ears on this. Discreetly. No mistakes." The line was silent for a moment before Sarah responded with a measured, "Consider it done." The faint click of the call ending echoed his resolve. Next, David reached out to Helen Banks, his trusted CFO. Helen's sharp mind and unwavering loyalty had been his anchor in the storm. When they met in a quiet upscale cafe downtown, her eyes scanned the documents he slid across the table. "These irregularities could sink us if they go public," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to act swiftly and silently. I'll tighten our internal audits and control the narrative." Her gaze met his with steel. "We cannot afford leaks." David nodded. "Agreed, and I'm bringing in someone who knows how to navigate shadows." He paused, then said, "Marcus Flynn. Former military intelligence. I trust him to uncover what we can't see." Helen raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She knew Marcus's reputation. He was a man who operated in the gray zones, skilled in surveillance and gathering secrets. A necessary but dangerous ally. Within days, Marcus arrived, tall and lean, his piercing eyes missing nothing. He moved with the precision of a trained soldier, setting up discreet cameras and tapping into communication networks with a quiet efficiency that impressed even the hardened veterans in David's circle. His presence was a stark reminder that this was no ordinary corporate battle. It had turned into a covert war. At night, David found himself haunted by the thought of Julian, still weak in the hospital, fighting to recover from the poison. The image of his pale, fragile son stirred a fierce protectiveness. He hired specialized medical consultants, experts in pediatric toxicology, and assembled a security detail to guard his family against threats that now felt all too real. Each security measure felt like a small fortress built against an invisible enemy. Despite the reinforcements, David's isolation deepened. Whispers in boardrooms, furtive glances, and the knowledge that every step he took could be monitored left him questioning every interaction. Who can I trust? He asked himself in the quiet moments. The lines between ally and adversary blurred, and paranoia crept like a shadow. One evening, Sarah brought troubling news during a hastily arranged meeting in an underground parking garage. Marcus has picked up chatter about increased security around certain executives. They know something's coming. Her eyes flickered with worry. We have to move carefully. David nodded, feeling the weight of command settle heavily on his shoulders. Every move we make from here on out will be under unseen eyes, he said, voice low but resolute. But we won't stop. As the pieces of the puzzle began to align, the true scale of the conspiracy dawned on David. This was no petty vendetta. It was a calculated, systemic assault designed to dismantle everything he had built. The stakes had never been higher. With each breath, with each guarded step, David knew the battle ahead would test not only his business acumen, but the very core of his will to protect what mattered most. Every move David made was shadowed by unseen eyes. The hospital corridor was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional distant murmur of nurses exchanging updates. David Langston sat rigid on a cold metal bench outside Julian's ICU room, his hands clenched into tight fists. The weight of the day's revelations pressed down on him like a crushing tide. The phone call that summoned him late into the night had shattered any fragile hope he'd been clinging to. Julian's condition had suddenly worsened, and doctors feared the poison coursing through his small body might have caused irreversible damage. Minutes earlier, Dr. Henry Collins, a stern but compassionate man in his mid-50s, had pulled David aside, his voice low but grave. Mr. Langston, the tests show significant organ distress. We're doing everything we can, but the toxins from the contaminated milk have caused critical damage. I won't sugarcoat this. The next 48 hours are crucial, but the prognosis is uncertain. David's jaw tightened. He swallowed the lump rising in his throat, forcing himself to focus. His son's fragile life now mirrored the fragile state of the company he had fought so hard to protect. The battle was no longer just about corporate power. It was a race against time, a fight for survival on two fronts. Just hours before, in the secure war room David had set up at his home, Marcus Flynn, the former military intelligence officer turned private investigator, laid out the latest findings with a grim expression. The dark screen in front of them flickered with financial spreadsheets, encrypted emails, and offshore bank transfers. Victor Crane isn't acting alone, Marcus said, pointing to the data. We've traced millions of dollars being funneled into offshore accounts over the past year. The money trails all lead back to a small network of CloudReach executives who've been siphoning funds under the radar. David leaned forward, eyes narrowing. So Victor's just the fall guy? Exactly, and there's more, Marcus continued, clicking through the files. Behind all this is a shadow figure, someone we're calling the Architect. This guy is pulling strings from the shadows, manipulating both sides, the saboteurs and those trying to fix the damage, to maintain control of the company's future. David rubbed his temples, feeling a surge of frustration. How deep did this go? How many faces he trusted were really hiding knives? The very foundation of his empire was riddled with betrayal. Meanwhile, Sarah Cole, the junior logistics officer whose courage had already proved invaluable, sifted through a folder of internal communications. She looked up, exhaustion etched into her features. The Architect's fingerprints are everywhere. Fake contracts, shell companies, false audits. He's playing a long game, David. Whoever he is, he's patient and ruthless. David's mind raced. He felt the familiar fire of determination flare up inside him, even as despair threatened to overwhelm. We can't let this destroy us, he said quietly. Not the company, not Julian. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from Helen Banks, his CFO. Press conference tomorrow. Media questions piling up. We need a plan to control the narrative. David glanced at the clock. Midnight was approaching. Every second counted. He rose, pacing the dim hallway. Thoughts swirled: the poisoned milk, the sabotage supplies, the offshore accounts, the architect's unseen hand. All pieces of a deadly puzzle, each one tightening the noose around his family and business. But beneath the chaos, David sensed a fragile thread of hope, a possibility to turn this nightmare into a fight he could win. He stopped outside Julian's door, placing a trembling hand on the frosted glass. His son was fighting, and so was he. In the darkest moments, David found a fragile thread of hope. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of multiple computer screens. Marcus Flynn's fingers flew over the keyboard with the precision of a seasoned professional, eyes scanning lines of encrypted code as if decoding a secret language. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the quiet hum of the machines amplifying the weight of the moment. David Langston stood behind Marcus, his posture rigid, every muscle taut with anticipation. This was no ordinary breakthrough. It was the key to unraveling the dark conspiracy that had threatened not just his company, but his family's future. Suddenly, Marcus's eyes widened and he leaned closer to the screen. "David, I've cracked it. This isn't just a series of isolated attacks. This is a coordinated plan for a full corporate takeover. The architect is playing a long game, designed to discredit Titan Arrow and push you out completely." His voice was low but urgent, laced with the gravity of what they had uncovered. David's heart pounded, a mix of relief and renewed resolve flooding his senses. "Show me everything," he demanded, stepping forward as Marcus pulled up a series of intercepted communications. Names, dates, financial transfers, each detail exposed a sprawling web of manipulation. The architect's reach was vast, weaving through layers of deception and control that no one outside this circle could have imagined. As they sifted through the evidence, one name stood out: Victor Lang. David's breath caught. The reclusive billionaire, known only through whispers and rumors, was the largest hidden shareholder of Cloudreach Airlines. Worse, Victor Lang was none other than Victor Crane's estranged uncle, a fact that added a bitter personal sting to the corporate betrayal. The family feud that had simmered beneath the surface for years had now ignited into a brutal war for control. David's mind raced, the pieces clicking together in a dangerous puzzle. He turned to Marcus, voice steady but fierce. "We need to confront Martin Keller again. He's been manipulated just like me. He needs to know the full picture if we're going to have any chance at stopping this." Later that day, David met Keller in a quiet downtown cafe, away from prying eyes and ears. Keller arrived tense, his usual cold demeanor replaced by a flicker of vulnerability. The weight of the conspiracy pressed heavily on both men. David didn't waste time. "Martin, you were used. The architect pulled the strings and it's Victor Lang behind everything. Your moves, the sabotage, it wasn't personal, just a pawn in a much larger game." Keller's eyes darkened, a mixture of anger and resignation flickering across his face. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "I knew there was more to this, but I didn't realize how deep the roots went. Lang's influence, it's poison. It's in every corner of this company, bleeding it dry from the inside." David nodded slowly, the reality sinking in. "We have to stop him, Martin. This family feud is killing everything, our companies, our reputations, even families. If this keeps going, no one wins." Keller met David's gaze with a hardened resolve. "Then let's end it, together." As they left the cafe, a quiet tension hung in the air, a fragile alliance forged in the shadow of betrayal. David knew this was only the beginning. The deeper they delved, the more dangerous the game would become. But for the first time in weeks, a glimmer of hope shone through the darkness. The poison had spread into the very veins of the company's history. David stepped into the cold, glass-walled conference room with his usual calm exterior, but inside, a storm of tension churned. The sterile air smelled faintly of polished wood and leather, a stark contrast to the invisible war about to unfold within these walls. Around the large oval table sat Victor Lang, the man who had pulled strings from the shadows for months, his steely gaze fixed on David. The room was fortified with security personnel discreetly stationed behind tinted glass, and legal observers took meticulous notes, their presence a reminder that every word spoken could become evidence in a high-stakes corporate battle. Victor Lang's expression was unreadable at first, a mask honed by years of ruthless power plays. But beneath that cold surface was a man who knew he was cornered. David could feel the weight of the moment pressing down. The fragile peace they were about to negotiate could shatter everything or mark the beginning of a fragile truce. Lang's voice broke the silence, low and deliberate. "You think you've won, David? That you can just walk in here and force me out with Keller's testimony and Flynn's evidence? You underestimate how deep my roots run." David met Lang's icy stare without flinching. "I don't underestimate you, Victor. I'm here because I have the proof, the documents, the surveillance, the money trails. Your network is unraveling. You can either cooperate and lessen the damage or face complete exposure." Lang's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his hands folded on the table, fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat as if counting the seconds until he could make his next move. "You don't understand the consequences, David. This company, this empire, it's bigger than you or me, and there are people who won't hesitate to destroy everything you've built, including your family." The words hung heavy in the room. David's mind flickered briefly to Julian's fragile recovery and the cost his family had already paid, but he refused to show any sign of weakness. "Threats won't work on me. I'm prepared to fight this to the end." Lang's eyes flickered, a flash of respect, or was it calculation, crossing his face. "Very well, I'll step down. I'll cooperate with the investigations. But mark my words," he said, voice dropping to a warning growl. "This isn't over." David felt a cold shiver, not from fear, but from understanding the truth behind those words. Victory here was only the beginning of another battle. The fight for his company and family was far from finished. As Lang's men gathered his papers and security guided him from the room, David remained seated, staring at the polished surface of the table, the reflection fragmented like the war he'd just survived. Outside the building, the city thrummed with oblivious life, but David knew better now. In Victory's shadow, new dangers lurked. The moment the news broke, the atmosphere inside Cloudreach's headquarters shifted palpably. The names of the corrupt executives echoed through the corridors, their faces splashed across every major news outlet. Arrest warrants were served swiftly. The legal machinery moved like a relentless tide. Victor Crane, once a shadowy figure of discontent, now sat shackled in a sterile interrogation room, his usual arrogance replaced by thinly veiled panic. David Langston stood outside the building, watching the chaos unfold with a cold, measured gaze. He knew this was no small victory. It was a hard-fought battle that had come at an immense personal cost. Inside the boardroom, the Cloudreach directors gathered to address the crisis with unprecedented urgency. Chairman Evelyn Marsh, a stern man with decades of experience in aviation, outlined the sweeping reforms that would reshape the company's future. "We cannot afford to let this happen again," Evelyn declared, voice firm yet tinged with regret. "Our entire culture must change. Transparency, accountability, and integrity will be our pillars going forward." The room buzzed with tense agreement, but beneath the surface, David sensed lingering resistance. Some still clung to old alliances and whispered doubts about Titan Arrow's expanding influence. Outside the corporate walls, the media frenzy continued. Headlines touted David as both the architect of salvation and a figure of controversy. Some praised his relentless pursuit of justice, others questioned his motives, painting him as a ruthless power player. But for David, the public battles were secondary to the quiet war waging in hospital rooms and boardrooms alike. Julian, his son, was slowly recovering. Each day brought a fragile hope as the baby's color returned and his feeble cries turned stronger. David held Marcus's hand tightly during the long nights, the weight of guilt and determination etched deep into his features. "I won't let anything threaten him again," David whispered one evening, voice barely above a breath, eyes locked on Julian's peaceful face. Marcus nodded, exhaustion and relief mingling in her tired smile. "We'll rebuild, stronger, for him and for all of us." Yet the ordeal had carved something new into David's soul, a cautious vigilance that settled in his bones. He became a man who measured every handshake, scrutinized every smile, and read between every line of corporate dialogue. Trust, once freely given, now came with a price. He instituted rigorous vetting procedures, brought in external auditors, and demanded radical transparency from his own team. His leadership style shifted from open collaboration to guarded strategy, a fortress built to withstand betrayal. Late one night, alone in his office overlooking the city skyline, David stared at the glowing outline of the Titan Aero logo on his screen. The victory felt hollow at times, overshadowed by the scars the battle had left behind. His thoughts drifted to the faces of those who had tried to destroy him, and to the unseen forces still lurking in the shadows. The war was far from over. The boardroom had given him the contract confirmation minutes ago. Titan Aero's expansion with Cloudreach was now official. It was a public endorsement of his vision and resilience. Yet David knew better than to celebrate too soon. "This isn't just about planes and profits," he muttered, voice tight with resolve. "It's about survival." The night deepened. The city lights flickered, a distant thunderstorm rolling in, echoing the turbulent path ahead. David's jaw clenched as he prepared for the next move in a game where every player had their own agenda, and every alliance was fragile. He had won this battle, but the lesson was clear, etched into every fiber of his being. David had won the battle but learned that trust was the most fragile currency. David stood at the edge of the polished runway, his gaze fixed on the sleek new Cloudreach aircraft gleaming under the afternoon sun. The crowd that had gathered for the unveiling was a mix of company executives, media personnel, and loyal employees, each person's eyes filled with cautious hope. The shiny fuselage, painted in bright white and blue, bore the name The Julian in elegant script, a symbol of the triumph and resilience his family had endured. For David, this moment was a bitter victory, heavy with the scars of a battle that had tested everything he held dear. As he stepped up to the podium, his posture rigid but his heart heavy, the murmurs among the crowd quieted. His voice carried steady but carried the weight of countless sleepless nights. "Today, we mark not just the launch of a new aircraft, but a new chapter for Cloudreach," David began, his eyes scanning the faces before him. A chapter defined by transparency, safety, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. His words hung in the air, charged with the memory of the pain that had come before. Every syllable was a testament to the long, grueling fight, his infant son, Julian's fragile recovery, the betrayal within the company's walls, and the costly struggle to reclaim control. Behind the calm professionalism, a storm brewed in David's mind. He thought of Julian's pale face in the hospital, the quiet moments where hope flickered between despair and recovery. He remembered the endless calls, the strategic meetings, and the shadows cast by enemies both seen and unseen. Now, as he spoke, David knew this unveiling was as much about healing wounds, personal and corporate, as it was about progress. Yet, even in this triumph, a nagging unease lingered. The applause echoed, sincere but cautious when a sharp voice interrupted the moment. Marcus Flynn, the private investigator who had become an indispensable ally in David's battle, approached swiftly from the side. His expression was serious, his dark eyes flickering with urgency beneath a furrowed brow. As the crowd's attention shifted, Marcus pulled David aside quietly, away from the microphones and flashing cameras. "I've uncovered something," Marcus said, his tone low but intense, his voice betraying no hesitation. financial irregularities in a subsidiary you thought was clean. The trail points to ghost accounts and shell companies, patterns consistent with the architect's methods. His words landed heavily, slicing through the relief like a blade. David's gaze hardened as he processed the information. So, despite everything, the architect's shadow remains. David's lips tightened into a grim line, his mind racing through possibilities and the implications of renewed betrayal. He looked over Marcus's shoulder toward the crowd, the smiling faces now seeming fragile masks against unseen threats. "It's not surprising," David admitted quietly. "The war never ends in places where power is the prize." His voice was steady but tinged with the weight of a man who had learned that victory was often temporary and peace elusive. They returned to the ceremony, but the tone had shifted. The audience, unaware of the new danger lurking beneath the surface, cheered as David concluded his speech, his smile carefully measured. He spoke of rebuilding trust and forging a future where loyalty and integrity would be paramount. Yet behind his calm exterior, David's thoughts churned with strategic calculations, already planning the next moves in this ongoing chess game. The unveiling ended with the ceremonial ribbon cut, the applause swelling once again, but David's eyes betrayed his inner resolve. As the crowd dispersed, he lingered by the aircraft, feeling the cool metal under his fingertips, a reminder of the fragile balance between progress and peril. Marcus stayed close, quietly watching the flow of people, his presence a silent reassurance. David glanced at the report Marcus had handed him, a digital dossier filled with transaction records and coded messages. The deeper he delved, the clearer it became that the conspiracy was not fully extinguished. This revelation was a stark warning that beneath the surface of triumph lay hidden currents of deceit and power struggles yet to be fought. He breathed deeply, the setting sun casting long shadows over the tarmac. Despite the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future, David felt a renewed fire within, a resolve tempered by hardship and sharpened by betrayal. He was no longer just a man fighting to save his company and his son. He was a guardian of a legacy, ready to face whatever storms remained. As Marcus finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm, David nodded, already preparing for the battles ahead. The crowd's cheers faded behind them, replaced by the quiet hum of engines and the distant call of a future still unwritten. In the world of power, the war never truly ends. He thought no one was watching, but the baby's father controlled the future. If you stand for justice, dignity, and accountability, hit subscribe and join the channel. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight the dangers of negligence and the importance of accountability in service industries. Its purpose is to raise awareness, promote empathy, and encourage respect and safety for all individuals.